This lecture is entitled Designing for Impact. Until now, you've been thinking and learning about the problem, the people that you might want to help, and how you might be able to help them. You're making a shift in thinking to focus on what might be the design of your project. Remember, design is simply the process of creating something by making motivated choices. But it really begs the question, motivated by what? Human-centered design argues that we should be motivated by what our user wants or needs. But who should be the user? By now you've noticed that lots of people related to the problem need help or to be better served by new innovations or systemic changes. And social workers might go further and argue that we should ultimately be motivated by the people we are trying to help, our beneficiaries. But the best way to help beneficiaries may not be to try to help them directly, but to help the people around them, even the people causing the problems. This is why we want to stay super clear about who is our user and who is our beneficiary. And the reality is lots of people who might be in a position to help our beneficiary all have lots of problems of their own. This can result in us feeling pulled in many different design directions and not being sure which direction to go in. But we can look to our exponential mindset, which tells us that we should design the intervention that will have the biggest positive impact. Okay, so we've got impact as our barometer, but measuring and assessing impact is in itself an important and complex topic. Just to look at a few questions we might ask, how do we actually know what is the biggest impact or the best outcome? How do we know what to measure or how to measure it? When we measure, what might we fail to take into account? And how do we account for exponential or systemic chain reactions? These are absolutely valid questions, and they're complex. And we can't measure every aspect of impact, but we can take a good look and come up with some things that help us better tell the story and help us better assess whether or not our innovations worked. So we may not get a single defining objective, but we have some healthy instincts and research-supported assertions about which impacts may be most important and needed. And so let's take a look at what those might be. I will also add that this is where the art of design meets the science of measurement and evaluation. So be flexible and be creative in what you're thinking about, what you're thinking might actually prove your point. So I like to think about impact along a couple of different lines. First, one of the most important impacts we care about is whether or not our problem was eradicated or reduced, and we can assess this by whether more or less people are experiencing the problem. We also look for improved outcomes, and these are really important. We want to be very driven by the outcomes that our innovation is intended to have. A lot of times these are described in qualitative and quantitative terms about behavior and well-being. We might even distill them down into things like accomplishments, like salary or advancement, or who got promoted, or who got housed. In some cases, we're going to look at improved outputs, but it's important to know that these are usually proxy measures. Usually outputs aren't so good when they're not really a proxy for whether or not there was a beneficial outcome produced from our innovation. So these proxy measures, these improved outputs, might be improvements in quality of the intervention or service. They might be improvements in the speed of delivery or service. They might be in a reduction of the cost to provide the service. They might also be an increase in access, flexibility, personalization, or increase in the number of people helped. And again, all of this is by way of saying that we think people are better off because we're able to do the work better, right? So here's some questions to think about when you're selecting your metrics. How are outcomes related to your problem currently assessed or measured? These might be a good place to look because users are using the same measurements that current industry or current best practices allow for. You might also want to ask when these are insufficient, because as innovators, our innovation may have outpassed the current assessments or best practices. We also want to look at what metrics the industry uses, generally speaking. We especially want to look at what metrics do our funders care about, because ultimately we have to prove to them to make sure we're getting the funds we need to operate. We also want to look at what data best indicates what's really going on with the problem. And lastly, you want to just gut check, does my data tell a compelling story? So by saying that we should focus on impact, it doesn't mean that there aren't other design considerations, especially for us in the nonprofit realm. So One thing to consider is whether or not you're dealing with a gravity or a functionally unactionable problem or circumstance. So what I mean by this is sometimes we just choose to accept things as the status quo or state of being of our innovation work. So for example, I might say, I don't think I'm going to be able to change a whole education system or a whole school system. So I need to operate within common core standards. Or I don't think I'm going to change HIPAA or public policy, so I'm going to have to operate within the laws that currently exist. And so you need to design for those laws. Because we're often in the nonprofit realm and we're often sponsored out, by other sources, we want to take into account our gatekeepers' needs and requirements, right? If we're relying on schools in order to distribute our innovation, we need to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the schools. If we have a funder who wants to give us money on certain conditions, we need to make sure that we're meeting those conditions. We always want to try wherever possible to make sure that our users' concerns and needs are paramount, but sometimes we have to do a juggling act and make sure that we're keeping a balanced perspective of all the stakeholders that are in play. Also, in our course, I like to think that personal motivation is a component. And so let's talk a little bit about personal motivation. So I do think personal preferences play a role. These might include your personal mission, your desired impact, your interests, even how hard you want to work, what your tolerance is for risk, or even any fears you may have. All of these may play a role in design. And I think it's worth some inquiry to understand how your motivations influence your design process. So you can design the project that you want, as well as the project that you think will have the most impact. So it's good to ask yourself where your personal motivations might be holding you back. If you have unconscious bias, assumptions, blind spots, and by the way, we all have blind spots. But sometimes too, your personal inquiry can actually point you to true north. By listening to you and what you really desire, by listening to that intuition, you might find a truly great innovation. So don't discount it. So let's talk a little bit about the practical implications of designing for impact. It's important that if you're asked, you're able to explain every aspect of why a design is the way it is. And we're going to work on that. You're going to get some practice in class. We also want to evaluate every design based on its potential for impact. And ultimately, if you've designed a few innovations that you think might meet your criteria, you want to pick the one that you think has the best shot, taking into account, of course, your risk profile. You want to make sure that you keep the solution space and opportunities to make choices as wide as possible for as long as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do this in the criteria lecture. So one last thing is try not to get attached to any one idea, approach, or design. There's a whole school of fruit growers out there in Japan that like to grow perfectly curated, beautiful fruit, and they're sold at an extremely high price. And the idea is that they're cultivating one beautiful, perfect thing. But innovators know it's better to cultivate lots of good ideas and then pick one that looks good. It's ultimately a more efficient and better use of our own time and resources. So with that in mind, go forth and design for impact. Thanks so much. I'll be back for the design criteria lecture.